Right. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our CityS Lab Research Coordination Network webinar series. I'm very happy to welcome our Erik Johnston to give us another talk on community engagement. So Becky will introduce the speaker. Becky, it's yours.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Becky Salazar, and I'm a student from Arizona State University and a part of the student work group for the CityS Lab Research Coordination. And I am honored to introduce our speaker for today. Dr. Erik Johnston is a professor with the School for the Future of Innovation and Society and the School of Complex Adaptive Systems at ASU. He is the co-director of the Center for Smart Cities and Regions and the chair of Human and Social Dimensions of Science and Technology Policy PhD program. Dr. Johnston earned a PhD in information with a certificate in complex systems from the University of Michigan. His research in smart cities and regions integrates open governance policy and policy informatics approaches to serve all communities, including participation from traditionally underserved populations. His research in opening governance explores how our governance systems can evolve to address increasingly complex challenges and to meet the rising expectations of the public to have many pathways to share their talents, data, expertise, and energy to improve their communities. He has been funded by the MacArthur, Robert Wood, Johnson, Sloan, Schmidt, Piper, and National Science Foundation. Today's talk explores how a community can internalize smartness as a set of principles and behaviors that promote discovery, deliberation, and understanding, a process that requires curiosity, humility, and empathy. Dr. Johnston also invited his colleague, Dr. Margaret Hinrichs, and a PhD student, Pooja Chitter, to join our discussion. I hopefully said your names right. I apologize. With that, I pass the floor to Dr. Erik Johnston. Thank you.
Thank you, Becky. That was wonderfully well done. And I don't think I need to do the introduction to my talk anymore. That's exactly what I wanted to discuss today. As noted, sort of what we're going to talk about is a way of articulating smart cities, not in terms of using technology to solve problems, but in terms of a series of principles and behaviors that empowers the community to become more curious, more empathetic, and more humble. Now, a quick note, I haven't used PowerPoint in a very long time, and so my entire talk is actually in the body of an email. One of the reasons I do this is if you actually want the talk, I can just put your name at the top of the email and then send it to you. But as a consequence of that, you're going to see a lot of text going by and a lot of images. You are not expected to be able to read the text at all times. It is really just for context later when I share this with you. Okay, so with that in mind, the broad sort of aspect is I want to focus really our attention on how a community can internalize smartness, not as an adjective, but as a set of principles and behaviors that promote discovery, deliberation, and understanding. And words that you probably don't hear that often when you think about smart cities in terms of curiosity, humility, and empathy. So what does it mean when I talk about behaving smarter? As the co-director of the Center for Smart Cities and Regions, I always struggle with how to articulate smartness because it seems everything under the sun falls underneath smart cities. And so what I think about is that a smart city cultivates new attention resources. And what I mean by that is people and expertise and capital brings new attention to problems and then spends that attention wisely. And so there's two categories that really falls into. The first category is reducing the amount of attention we spend poorly. And so is there something in your life that you're paying way too much attention to right now that you'd prefer not to ever think about again? And in our past, we actually have seen this in a lot of different areas. And most people, I think, when they think of smart cities, this is the type of problem that they think about. And so when you think about paying your bills, back in my day, which is a day a long time ago, you'd actually allocate half of a Sunday afternoon to sit down and go over all your bills and to write checks out for things and then mail the checks into the specific agencies that they had to do. Now everything is automated and you might check in with how your bills are going, but you can go an entire month or an entire year without really consciously thinking about paying your bills. The other idea is how much time and energy do you spend on traffic? And how would it be if you didn't have to think about how to navigate traffic in certain environments? And so the advent of Waze or Google Maps that have traffic notes or meeting in Zoom are ways of making it smarter because we have to spend less time on thinking about navigating traffic. Now, the next one's an interesting example, which is supply chains. So back in the day, or not back in the day, You could go right now and grab sort of this amazing book that no one has ever purchased and click on buy now. And with one click, it will show up at your house in 2 days. You don't have to worry about what happens after you push click because the supply chain has been completely automated. It just seems to appear in 2 days or less. But there's an interesting note on this, which is that when we think about these infrastructures that we're building, when they function well, they should be invisible. But right now, one of the biggest conversations in the United States, especially around supply chains and how they're starting to break down because of the pandemic and because of everything else that's happening. And so this one is no longer being as visible and we're needing to pay more attention to it. But when it's operating well, you don't think about sort of where you're getting your book from. The other thing that we'd like to focus on is being able to make invisible what other parts of the system know what. And what I mean by that is when you go to Google and you type in a question, you don't necessarily worry about who the expertise is that's providing you the answer to the question. Your focus is on what is the question. When we're addressing big societal problems like heat vulnerability or homelessness or other challenges, we recognize that there's huge communities and groups that are all trying to address this, but they're addressing it from their own part of the system. And we don't necessarily know who is working on what. So Margaret Henricks, who's going to be talking in a little bit, and I have developed a series of convergent workshops at the Decision Theater, where the intent is to bring together different parts of systems that are working on shared problems. A shared problem like heat vulnerability that you see in this picture, where they share their data, they share their questions, and by working collaboratively, we start to think, well, this is how the system is approaching this type of problem and how we can collectively go to solve it. Another one that I think is incredibly relevant in terms of reducing the amount of attention we spend is if you have type 1 diabetes, how much time and attention do you spend on regulating your insulin levels? We worked with a collection of people as part of our Robert Wood Johnson project that designed and developed their own artificial pancreas, which was a way of anticipating and managing their levels of insulin based on computational analysis, based on measurements of continuous glucose monitoring, and based on an insulin pump that they hacked together in order to come up with an artificial pancreas that functions better than ours. And so this was a group that said, we are too worried about this on a regular basis. Is there a way that we can hack it so that we don't have to have this as a mental burden as much? So those are 5 examples of different ways that we can reduce the amount of attention that we pay on things that we'd prefer not to pay attention on. But then you have the second category of problems, which is how can we increase the amount of attention on problems that we should pay more attention to? And so the first that I like to bring up is the idea of the salaries or pay gaps. That one of the biggest interventions to improve equity in terms of pay was making visible how much people get paid. When we didn't even know the gap existed, a lot of things were able to be hidden, but by making it visible, it changed sort of the dynamics of what happened within the environment. Another one that we should pay more attention to is what about our water quality? A lot of you might have had some experience with a situation in Flint in the water quality within Flint or in Pennsylvania. This is a map in terms of looking at the lead levels of water within Flint, Michigan. But if we pause for a second and I ask you, well, what about your water? How is that? You might not know the answer in terms of what is the quality of water within the community that you're a part of. And unfortunately, as you zoom out, you recognize that Flint is not the only one. Wait a minute, I just realized a lot of you guys are in New York, so let's head over there. Flint is not the only one that's struggling with the quality of water, the amount of lead in the quality of their water. And so part of the major sort of $1.2 trillion infrastructure package is saying that this is a national problem, we have to reduce it. But did you even know that this was a challenge or was not a challenge within the area that you're a part of? Or what about air quality? And so one of the projects that Margaret has been a part of was about a community that believed that a functioning mine next door to them was poisoning them. Because they would hear these explosions from the mine, they would see dust, and they seemed to have higher than normal levels of respiratory distress. But they didn't know for sure. And so what Margaret helped do was set up a series of citizen science approaches to put air quality monitors that monitored the air quality in real time throughout their entire neighborhood, including along the edge of where the mine was. And what they found out was it wasn't the explosions from the mine that were causing their distress, but it was the trucks that were going in and out of the unpaved street that was kicking up dust, which was then causing them distress. But this was a way of engineering an environment that allowed for them to pay attention to something and to be curious about what was actually happening. One other is, what about sort of the advent of opioids as a public health crisis across the United States? This has been something that's been happening for over a decade, but was largely a silent epidemic that people didn't really know was occurring until, and this is one of the interesting comments about this, until coroners started recognizing that they were identifying the cause of death as opioids far more often than they had in the past. But if you look at the history of this, there is still a huge gap between when the coroners recognized that this was an epidemic and when the general public recognized that it was an epidemic. And the reason why is that the coroners didn't know who to tell about this. And so here's one of the first visualizations about sort of the spread of opioids throughout the country. And when you make it visible, you make it sort of something that we can start paying attention to. A fourth thing that we can make visible is, what about possible futures? What does our future look like if we can reduce the amount of carbon in the air so that we have a only 1% or 1 degree increase in temperature versus a 2 degree versus a 3 degree? How do those possible futures look like? And when we start paying attention to what's possible, what choices do we have and what options can we make? Or even the more tricky concepts. What does it look like if we were to make justice visible and see where is justice more widely held? Or what about vulnerability? And we could understand very clearly within our communities which ones are vulnerable and which ones are not. Or what happens if we could make empathy visible? And as we think about sort of as we're about to collaborate and as we're about to put ourselves on the lines and at risk, if you could see the amount of empathy that a community had, or see the deficits of empathy that a community had, how would that change the way that you make decisions? And this might seem hypothetical, but this is actually one of our National Science Foundation research projects that we backed into. I'm so excited that there's 37 people here. So we backed into our research on empathy and kindness when we're part of a team building an interactive simulation looking at the governance of Chesapeake Bay. The Chesapeake Bay is a large body of water that serves 7 different states, and it's very challenging to govern. The simulation we helped create with the University of Virginia allowed over 1,000 people to simultaneously interact with each other for weeks at a time to project alternative futures for the Bay. And if you were a participant, you actually were assigned a specific role. You were either a farmer, a policymaker, a real estate developer, or a crab fisherman. Now, as part of people that build the models, we wanted to validate the model. And so as a part of the process of validating the model to see if it was reasonable and articulated what was happening well, we reached out to the local community. In particular, we reached out to farmers to see if our simulation was actually representing what they were thinking about. And we were completely caught off guard when the farmers said they had no intention of collaborating with us. This caught us off guard, but their logic was that every time they interacted with the university or the government, the end result was they were told they needed to change their ways. From their perspective, it was them against the rest of the Bay. So it took us a while to build trust with the farmers, but eventually they agreed to participate with us. And after playing the simulation, they agreed that the choices they made in terms of which crops to farm, how much fertilizer to use, and when to harvest were reasonably similar to the choices that they were making every month. And so once they had confidence in the simulation, we asked them to play the role of the crab fisherman, which were their perceived natural enemies. And within a few rounds, their insights were amazing. They would be able to tell us, I see why the crabbers have been complaining about our fertilizer runoff, but I see a simple solution. If we can coordinate our planting with their harvesting, we won't have the problems and we won't have the conflicts. What changed was that instead of seeing the crab fishermen as enemies or a threat, they empathized with them as another legitimate part of the system. And now they could find common solutions to shared problems. Another way of saying this is that instead of seeing themselves as competing teams playing offense and defense, they saw themselves as part of the same community that shared a common fate about the health of the Bay. Now, one quick note that's an aside is that the concept of empathy is used by many people in many different ways, like smart cities, but most of the time empathy is loaded unfairly with the notion of weakness. So as scientists, we decided to test that claim, and as part of the National Science Foundation grant and in experiments, the Decision Theorem, which I'll talk about later, we have found that groups with higher levels of empathy were more likely to collaborate, more likely to share resources. The individuals in the groups received greater individual earnings, and perhaps most surprisingly, empathetic groups were more likely to protect themselves from individuals that try to take advantage of them. The takeaway from our research on empathy is that a well-developed capacity for empathy and kindness is actually a deep form of strength. And understanding the role of empathy opens up new models and practices of collaboration. The models that we helped develop here ended up becoming the first time agent-based models have ever been published in the Academy of Management that looked at alternative ways of organizing different communities and what are the consequences of that and which ones need more empathy than others. Now, to try to sort of have a coherent message across all these different projects, I want to emphasize one of the projects that Margaret and I worked at the Decision Theater called the Chief 60 with the Arizona Board of Regents. This collaboration was because of a policy in Arizona that said by 2030, we want 60% of adults to have a post-secondary education. And we want to use the Decision Theater to build models and simulations to look at alternative futures and alternative ways that we could get there. And we're very excited by this project, especially because it had the influence or the ability to change what was possible. But we changed the way we designed the project and we said, well, we have two different sort of asks for you in terms of models of collaboration. First is we want to spend half the budget, not on building the models, but on building relationships with people that can enact the things that we discovered here. And we want to invest in bringing them in to help us build the models. The second thing that we are going to ask you is that instead of you giving us the money and showing up a year later or 2 years later to see what we built, that you're with us every single week as we're building this, because your participation in the model building process will be one of the most valuable things that you get out of this. I'll come back to this example in a second. The next section is thinking about smart cities being measured by who we include and how they succeed. And so if I were to ask this collection of 35 incredibly smart people, do you have ideas about how we could increase the vaccination rates in your community? My guess is we would be able to brainstorm some amazing things right now. Have you been asked how you can increase the vaccination rates in your community? And if not, then we're losing out on the amazing insights that you have. And in fact, one of the things that we study with the current NSF grant that we have is who actually participates in civic technology. And does civic technology serve every community equally well? And so a project that we have in Boston is looking at who uses their 311 systems, which is basically reporting graffiti, reporting snow removal. And we have years and years of their data. And what we find is there's huge disparities in terms of who uses this civic technology. It turns out the people most likely to use civic technology are people that look like the developers or people that trust government. But we don't have sort of an equal level of use in terms of who actually uses it. And this is important because if we think about different ways to empower communities, we have to take advantage of both top-down best practices as well as the bottom-up local knowledge and curiosity within the community. And we have to allow people to discover for themselves what works for our community and what makes the most sense for our values, our resources, our history, our constraints, our diversity, et cetera. And one example of this is who actually makes these discoveries. And so here's a study one of my students did that was looking at, I think this was the South Beach diet, that found that if you had 221 people that did the South Beach diet for a month, on average, they would lose 7 pounds. But here's the individual weight loss of the 221 people. And what you recognize is that although on average they lose 7 pounds, your individual experience is going to vary tremendously. So it's key as you think about these civic projects that we have. And Pooja told me about sort of smart cities in India recently, where they said, well, we're going to give smart cities technologies to hundreds of communities. That's sort of like saying, well, hundreds of communities will do the South Beach diet. But how do you know which one of these individuals you are, and how do you engineer it so that you can discover what diet works for you if that's the goal that you want to? What smart city effort works for you because of the conditions that you have as a smart city? Which gets to the next question: who is asked to actually solve these problems? Did someone decide smart cities is better than push it onto everyone, or did we create the conditions that allowed for a community to be smart? One of the projects that we have is looking at heat in Arizona. And heat is a huge problem within Arizona, especially heat vulnerability and heat deaths. And so one of the early projects that we were looking at was that the Department of Health could solve what's happening in Arizona if they had enough money, but they don't. It's not one of the top priorities. But there are huge communities of people that are all trying to make safe spaces or cooling centers or ways to sort of protect their different residents within their local neighborhoods. And it turns out these groups are largely unorganized. And so one of the projects we had was to build an agent-based model with them. And so we had students and the new head of heat resilience for Arizona go out to each one of the cooling centers and say a couple things. One, where are you? What time are you open? And who do you serve? And so this is a map of where people were located. And unfortunately, I don't have time to sort of bring it to life. But what it would show is sort of where people were located, what time of day and what heat was occurring, and when they closed. And what this would show if it was sort of active was that at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, all these blue dots would go silent, yet it was still incredibly hot. And as soon as the people saw this, they said, I can't believe that we all close at the same time, especially during one of the most vulnerable periods for the community. Can you give me the number of the people next to us so that we can help coordinate our times with their time so that someone is always open? And oh, look at this huge gap that exists, or look at this huge gap that exists over here. Maybe we can start allocating some more of our resources so that we don't have so much overlap in this area and that we're covering more of the valley. What this led to is the idea of using information platforms or information environments to enable self-governance and self-organization. Because you can imagine a very different response if the Department of Health went to these communities and said, hey, we need to move you over here and we need to move you over here. And here are the hours that you guys are all going to operate. They would have responded incredibly poorly to that because they were self-determined about how they were going to help. But by giving them the conditions that allowed for them to discover how much of a contribution were they making to this system-wide challenge, they changed their own behaviors because of their own insights and their own opportunities. Now, another key aspect about this is who actually gets to frame the questions that we're actually researching or trying to solve. And two of my favorite quotes in this area is learning answers without learning questions produces a kind of ideology in which everything is already settled, in which contingencies appear as necessities, in which social constructs appear as natural inevitabilities, in which everything is what it is, nothing more, nothing less. A simpler way to understand that is if you can get people to answer the wrong questions, it doesn't matter what their answers are. And so going back to that education model, part of the value of having the Board of Regents show up every single week to help build it with us is to get them to think about different types of questions. And so remember, the goal was, how do we get 60% of Arizonans to achieve a post-secondary education by 2030? Within a couple of weeks, the question came up, which 60? Does it matter? What are the consequences of different types of 60%? And you found the answer to that was very important. And so we could just imagine the convenient 60%, which is just the ones that are closest to getting a degree. You could imagine an equitable version of 60%, that within every community within Arizona, we want 60% of people to get it. Or you can imagine the strategic 60%, which says if we could target different communities, because we understand that not all degrees are equal, what is the 60% we would ideally get if we could have 60%? And you understand that sort of with that question, it fundamentally changes how you approach the problem. And I'm embarrassed to say, and I know this is being recorded, but it took us months to ask the question, what about the other 40%? Does that matter? Are we thinking about sort of 60% and 70%, or are we thinking that maybe this will be bimodal? And it completely changes the type of conversation. Or what about the relationship between attainment and resilience? Can we discover why communities with higher educations are more likely to survive a pandemic? Or what about where are we going to get our teachers and nurses? Because one of the things we discovered early was they came from very different communities than where we got our engineers. Or how vulnerable are different communities based upon the jobs that they currently have to automation? And therefore, which one should we prioritize if we're thinking about new jobs programs? Again, the types of questions that are being created fundamentally changed the research that was happening. And so the challenge is to design inclusive governance infrastructures that allow for the detection, deliberation, and discovery of what's possible. What can we do, and how can we marshal our attention and our resources to do it? Now, the process that Margaret and I and others at Decision Theater have helped develop is co-designing the future. And so for a while, we've had an ongoing debate with any researcher we encounter, including all my students, about what we need more of in society right now. If you could double the amount of knowledge society has or the amount of curiosity society has, which would you double? And I'm not waiting around for answers because I'm going really fast. But what I find is about 95% of people tell me that we should double curiosity. Yet, if you think about the way we organize our universities, the way the National Science Foundation is organized, we tend to prioritize knowledge. But I would agree with the 95% that says that we need more curiosity by far, especially by people in power, because we're witnessing this strange shift where a certainty of knowledge is being rewarded over accuracy of knowledge. And this is particularly unfortunate because at its core, curiosity is a vulnerability of knowledge. It's being comfortable wondering what might be instead of demanding that we are sure we know what is. When we approached the pandemic, it was important for us to remain with healthy skepticism because of how much we didn't know and how much we had to continually be curious about what futures might be coming our way. So the challenge becomes, how do we get the powerful to be curious? Now, one of the projects that we have, which is one of my favorite projects, is that a few years ago, the city of Phoenix needed to decide how much to invest in transportation until 2050. And before our center became involved, the best case scenario was a continuation of the sales tax of 0.4%. Now, I want to take a step back and say that a tax is neither a good thing nor a bad thing in and of itself. It is only in the context that it can be judged. A well-designed tax invests the money of the public to create a good they could otherwise not create independently, but a poorly designed tax squanders the resources and the trust of the public. Now, to understand how they were making these decisions, the City of Phoenix and the Citizen Committee, we were invited to attend a 3-hour committee and a committee meeting. And at that 3-hour committee meeting, they spent the entire time, the discussion was dominated the entire time by a few people discussing whether or not there should be free Wi-Fi on buses. So to help the city committee and the future of Phoenix transportation discover what was best for Phoenix, what we did is we created an interactive information environment where they had the opportunity to budget different transportation priorities and different futures, and look at the immediate consequences of what this would have on the budget for the next 30 years. In subsequent meetings about the funding, revealed that if they keep the taxes the same, they did not get the light rail expansion they wanted. And in order to reduce taxes, which many of them wanted, they actually had to cut service and maintenance. And if they got to increase taxes, they could see how it would improve the infrastructure and modernize Phoenix. I need to be very clear ethically here that our objective was never to steer the committee toward any particular outcome, but to get them to be curious about what if options to inform them with the best evidence. At the end of the day, the committee ended up deciding to nearly double the transportation tax for the next 35 years, resulting in an increase of $13.5 billion over city staff's expectations for the transportation investment. And our high-tech smart city innovation was this. It was papers and options that were scaled proportional to the cost of the different options that were available. And so if you wanted to have 24-hour bus rail service, that's how much it cost. And over on this side of the table was different options in terms of dawn to dusk bus ride service or just work hours bus ride service. And you could see proportionally how much each of the different things cost. So they were put into context. My favorite side note of this is this dot right here, this small little blue square, that was free Wi-Fi on buses. And as soon as each one of the groups saw that, every single group promoted that and said, of course we want that. And they quickly moved on and they focused their attention on where there is real tension in terms of how often do we repave the streets or how much light rail expansion do we need if each light rail expansion, which are these orange ones, cost this much. Now, there's a hidden warning that I have to mention is that this was one of the most successful outcomes for the city of Phoenix, and everyone we worked with got double promoted, which means that they didn't just get promoted to the next stage, but got promoted to the stage after that. And so when it was time to actually implement this process, all of our collaborators were no longer in the department because they had been double promoted to somewhere else, and we were no longer involved in the project. Now, that leads to another sort of question in terms of, can we use these sort of information technologies, or can we use these collaborative environments to foster collaboration and create sort of a design deliberation space to address collective challenges? And we found that you can, and that to do so, you have to be incredibly strategic about how you approach it. The ethical or the practical sort of consideration there is that if you are in service of something like transportation modeling or water modeling or food, energy, water nexus, you should be in service of the problem, not your specific agenda. It is important to be a humble modeler and be focused on how do we inform the decisions that are being made instead of saying, well, we have figured out the answers, let us convince you of the right ones. Now, the approach that we take, and Margaret might or might not talk about this later, is what we call focus stacking. Now, focus stacking is a photography term that recognizes that any individual picture needs to pay attention to one part of the picture so it's in focus, but the rest of the picture is out of focus. And so this is looking at sort of putting into focus different elements and then combining all those or stacking all those together so that you have a clear picture of the entire system. Now, we find that this also happens in terms of individual expertise. That if you're a lawyer, you're very well focused on lawyeristic questions. If you're a politician, you focus on a certain type of questions. If you're an education person, you're focused on certain types of questions. And so the discipline is one type of way that you get focused on certain things, but other things are out of focus. By bringing together different people with different disciplines, you get a broader and more coherent sense of how to look at the system completely in focus. But you also see focuses at different scales, or different regions or different timelines. And so as we think about sort of focus stacking, we look at many different dimensions to bring together people so that we have a more coherent and more sort of concise version of what the entire system is looking like. Toward this end, we need to avoid the temptation to invite everyone because we want to include as many important voices as we possibly can, but we have to recognize that the inclusion of each additional voice comes at a cost. And we have to balance the cost in terms of maintaining the authentic relationship with those additional voices in terms of how much do they add to the conversation, how much do they add to what we're able to do. And so if you're curious about sort of managing the inclusion process, we've written about sort of the strategic ability to include more and more people. The second aspect about this, which is incredibly important, is to make sure that this is an authentic collaborations, that people are in service of the problem, it's important that they approach it with humility. And so part of the project that we had with Robert Wood Johnson and the artificial pancreas that I mentioned earlier was that community was doing such amazing work. Everyone wanted to study them. And so researchers from Harvard and MIT and NYU and ASU all wanted to study this community. Bless you. And what the community found was normally they were being treated as subjects instead of being seen as co-equal participants in the creation of new knowledge. And so what we helped them to create was something called the humility audit, which says that before you go into a community, before you help to solve someone else's problems, are you coming from a space of humbleness? Or do you think that you know better than anyone else and you're just trying to impose sort of your knowledge, your expertise, your understanding of what's happening? And this is a tool that we developed with them. So going back to the education model, it was important for us to realize that a lot of discoveries were taking place with the creation of the model, but how do you communicate them? And so we needed to make sure to translate the findings into the language of which the people that needed to act on them understood. And so we developed a series of communication briefs for the Achieve 60 project that we'd hand out and start the conversations with in terms of, here's a series of questions, here's what we found interesting, what more do you want to know? The other thing we learned is that we loved the Decision Theater, but we knew we couldn't bring everyone from the state to the Decision Theater to talk about education every time. So we developed what we called the Roadshow, and it allowed for the ability to create these sort of engineered curiosity environments wherever the people were themselves, to allow for them to be curious in their home environment to be able to figure things out. And we even created an online version of that simulation. Then the other aspect is to encourage this as part of the culture. And by this, I mean the regular seasons of discovery. And so the design of the project was to say, every year, here are the main questions we ask. And as people start coming up with new questions, that will be put onto next year's roster in terms of questions we might develop. But we had a process that said we regularly invite curiosity. We will continue to wonder what is possible. And here is when you see your question might come up in the future. So getting back, and as I wrap this up, we get to sort of smart as an ethos, that we want to focus our attention in how our community can internalize smartness, not as the adjective, but as a set of principles that promote discovery, deliberation, and understanding, where you see curiosity, humility, and empathy are fundamentally important, not just as abstract concepts, but as part of your culture. And so at ASU, we rally around sort of the ASU charter that talks about that we're responsible for the communities of which we serve. We also brag that we've been named the most innovative university in the country, I think 6 years in a row. And although we laugh about it, it's interesting how often it comes up, how it's ingrained as part of our identity of being part of ASU. And the charter is prominent within different places within the campus, and everyone can almost recite, the majority of what the charter says by heart. What does that mean in terms of smartness for your community, for your city, for everything else? What are the practices that would reinforce that anyone can be curious, anyone can participate? When someone makes a discovery, here are the pathways that you share it with or test it out, or that you can help make the community that you're a part of better. And so taking one step back as I finish up, I want to emphasize the questions I did not ask in any of these projects. I did not ask how should farmers fertilize their crops. I did not ask when should cooling stations be open. I did not ask how to create an artificial pancreas. I did not ask how much money should Phoenix spend on transportation. And I did not ask what 60%. Those were not the questions that I had. Those were the questions that were part of the community. But the questions I did ask was, how do we design inclusive governance infrastructures to support detection, deliberation, and discovery? Or how do we engineer societal transitions? Or what is the role of empathy and collaboration? Or how do we grow collaborations? Or how do we use an information environment to enable self-organization? These are context irrelevant. They allow for a lot of people and a lot of projects to come up with approaches to common solutions and become more scalable. And this is something that I've been thinking about for a long time. And so back in 2010, I wrote sort of a perspective piece about what governance infrastructures would look like last year. And it really talked about sort of rethinking the idea of smart governance infrastructures to include more participation at the intersection of systems, people, policy, practices, and relationships that take advantage of information technologies, but are not only because of information technologies. And so if you would like to, we have discussants now, and I don't know how to transition because I've never had a discussant before, but that is the sort of core of the talk. I have asked both a colleague of mine who's worked on a number of these projects, Margaret Hendricks, who I would recommend goes first, and then she can hand it off to Pooja Chetri, one of the students that's now getting involved in a lot of these projects. Margaret?
I've never been a discussant before, so yes, I'll just grab the baton and run with it. So again, thank you and hi everyone. My name is Margaret Hendricks. I'm an assistant research professor at ASU. I've worked with Erik for a couple years at this point in the Decision Theater and a couple other projects. And one thing I might add or contribute, if this is a body of research you're interested in, is that we've pulled a lot from literature on boundary organizations and boundary objects. And so I'm dropping a link in the chat to a paper we recently wrote for European Journal of Futures Research that really goes into detail of the education project that Erik just mentioned, as well as another project related to serious mental illness and systems for health funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And so this paper kind of compares these two different projects, compares the different level of community involvement in them, and talks a little bit about framing ASU's Decision Theater as a boundary organization and the different kinds of accountabilities and responsibilities that a boundary organization has. It doesn't go as much into the boundary object literature, but if you're interested in the use of data informatics as boundary objects, there's a lot in that body of literature that you can start with and start reading. We've kind of got a couple other papers in the works, like the focus stacking paper that Erik mentioned, that pulls a lot more from the boundary object literature, but it's a pretty popular search term if you just kind of go into Google Scholar and start looking for it. The other thing, that kind of like nugget, I guess I'll plant and then I'll stop talking so we can, I'll hand it to Pooja and then we can, field questions, is really circling back to the importance of the interpersonal aspect of all of this. I mean, the technological abilities to share data are there. It's really about the interpersonal trust that we feel as part of a collaboration in sharing that data and in being curious, because I think there's an inherent vulnerability in allowing yourself to be curious and allowing yourself to question things and admit that you might not know the answer to everything. And so having vulnerability in a space can be greatly enhanced by the interpersonal trust that you feel with the other people in the room, and a lot of the things that Erik was talking about in terms of what he's found in his empathy research, and just our ability to kind of relate to people across really diverse, complex problems is something we've really tried to cultivate, is a sense of curiosity, but also empathy and a willingness to question. I'll hand it to Pooja.
Thank you. So again, like Margaret, this is my first time. I've never been a discussant before. And also I will be mindful of the time. I want to give time for questions. So I'll start with what my biggest takeaway from this talk has been. It has been the unique conception of what smartness is. Like the popular narrative of smart cities or being smart is always more data, more technology, increased technology, or technology being the panacea for all our public problems of service delivery, efficiency, effectiveness, everything. But this could be a trap because this is so technologically deterministic. Not that I'm making technology a villain here, but this conception does not leave a lot of room for possible or alternative futures. And again, this, like Dr. Johnston mentioned, this comes from various stakeholders having their own part. This is like siloed focus. So by thinking in terms of curiosity, humility, and empathy, it allows us to co-create, co-design, not just our futures, but also our present. Here, the vision is not very absolute as in the other scenario is, but it is always continuous. And by establishing a culture of curiosity, we are able to ask questions that really matter. Like in case of AZ60, it was who are we paying attention to, or what factors are we attending to or not attending to? By focusing on people and relationship, like Dr. Hendricks mentioned, I would also add to it, we also need to focus on the inter-organizational relationships. We can actually center the values which matter to all the communities, different stakeholders. And this is very important to make that, again, something Dr. Johnston mentioned, making invisible visible. And this is very important because there are certain communities which are always judged to be judged as not knowers. This is due to sexism, casteism, racism, and more often than not as a function of their position or profession in the society, which is very unjust. And so in a world where our institutions, like our democratic institutions, our values are being under attack, I think this conception of being curious, humble, kind, empathetic will allow us to safeguard both our values and institutions. So I think I'll close my comments with this and give it back.
Well, thank you everyone for the wonderful discussion. And I think we are going to open up for our audience to ask their question as well. And if you can pose your question, or if you wanted to, I think Erik is posting, if you want the notes of the talk, send a note to erikwj@mac.com. Erik, I'm going to start with a question. You have engaged with a very broad range of stakeholders, and throughout this process, what do you see as challenges dealing with different kind of stakeholder? And I know you mentioned about sometimes you cannot put all of them together. A lot of voice becomes probably going to be hard to control. What is your take on engaging different type of stakeholders and how to maintain their interest in working with you?
So the biggest challenge is making them want to collaborate with us. And what I mean by that is the very first week I got to ASU, I was charged with coming up with an understanding of how does decision theater work and when can we collaborate with people. And one of the models we had was looking at alternative places we could put light rail stations. And is this beautiful 3D model that you could fly through and everything else. So I called up the Department of Transportation and said, you should collaborate with us. Have you seen our model? And they said, we're good. I'm like, what do you mean you're good? They're like, we have a way of determining where light rail stations are going to be that we're accountable for. And that's the process that we're going to use. And so at that point, that's when I realized it wasn't about creating the best knowledge. It was about creating the relationships and understanding where they were struggling with the types of decisions they needed to make and how we could be of service to them. And so the second real quick example of this was the early versions that we had in terms of water scarcity and the water scarcity models that Decision Theater created. We brought together all of our geologists and the scientists that could understand this, came up with a bunch of models, and then went to the water providers and said, we've solved all of your problems. Like, look, here's our amazing solutions to anything that you could think about. And the water providers said, you know nothing of our work. These aren't the things we're struggling with. These aren't the accountabilities we have. And so it took us years to rebuild that relationship. And this is where we came up with what we called the Trojan horse approach, which was that we would invite the experts in who were our targeted audience to help us co-create the models and tell them honestly and authentically, you are the experts, you're helping us to, understand this. But by them participating in the process, it allowed for them to be curious. It changed the way they thought about it. And the models that were created then were grounded and understood by them because they were part of the creation process. And we said, well, we're trying to understand this overall thing, but ultimately we wanted to get them to think more systematically. We wanted to understand the conflicts they were dealing with and provide more of a context for them to be making decisions. So the biggest challenge was that relationship development.
So that, my understanding is it usually take years to build. And in our findings also, when you're working with different agencies, because you're looking at interconnection between food, energy, and water and different infrastructures, sometimes the agencies might have competing interests.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you see as a way to, I know that in your case, you have the different kind of budget, options that you show them. But if you have, say, the farmers and also the crabbing, they have some conflicting interests, and then some of the policymakers might have a different perspective in those things. What would you suggest in, do we bring them all together or like understand them individually?
So I just put a link up that was an article published from some colleagues of ours at ASU this week that talked about what are the big obstacles for collaborative governance approaches at the food, energy, water nexus. And one of the things that they identify is this sort of difference of scales, difference of languages, difference of perspectives. But that's what focus stacking is really trying to get at. And so we had a model at the Decision Theater called Easy Smart, which was looking at where to put solar power within Arizona. And part of that was building the relationship with the environmentalists that said, what are the environmental questions we need to include in this model? Then it was with the lawyers, then it was with the economists, then it was with others. And so we had all these different perspectives about saying, to have a complete conversation about where to put solar, what needs to be included, what values do you look at, and what do you see as success? So what outcome measures are you looking at? And so with the education model, we did the same thing. We kept bringing in people and said, describe to me what you think a healthy education system looks like. What are you going to look for? What values are you sort of taking? What data would you track if you could track anything? And so we continue to build out sort of the diversity of perspectives about how do people talk about healthy energy systems or education systems, et cetera. And then you find that when you're deliberating about different futures, if someone's really focused on equity, which was one of our big funders in the education system, we had multiple different metrics in that model that looked at levels of equity. And so as someone proposed something like a tax on a certain area or an investment in a certain area, they could monitor, did that increase or decrease equity and in which way? And if it was fine, then they sort of, didn't say anything and the conversation went on. But if it was a threat to the thing they cared about, they said, now there's a tension here. And now we can focus on where there is a conflict between our values and their values. But again, one of the things I want to highlight here is the importance of saying there's real conflict that we should be paying attention to. But a lot of our previous conversations, we had so many people grandstand over imagined conflicts. And so in one of the early water simulations, the big argument was about personal responsibility. And then we would say, okay, well, if you believe personal responsibility is here, solve the water problem with just, interventions that use personal responsibility. And they'd quickly find out that sort of, showering a little bit less or changing your toilet or anything else had almost no effect compared to urban design or reduction of agriculture or population sort of management. And then they quickly got off the soapbox and said, it seems like the conflicts are really at these other places. Let's talk about the trade-offs associated with these broader concepts, and so it allowed for the focus on different questions. Oh, yes, I want to talk about the Trojan horse. Michael? You're muted.
Thank you. Really fascinating presentation, really excellent. And in New York, we've had the same a parallel issue of working with agencies. Our focus is working with wastewater treatment agency. And, they have their mission, they have their focus, and that's what they prioritize. So I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about how, when you brought agencies in and they're experts, who had told you, well, we know the solutions that we're following. What was your experience? What did you do that when you brought the experts in, prompted them to give you different answers than they had already, encoded in their heads as the solutions that they needed? Did you ask them different kinds of questions? Did you ask them to focus on different things than they normally focused on? What's the secret sauce in the Trojan horse?
So the secret sauce in the Trojan horse is, one, treat them with respect and as the experts sort of at what they're doing, because they are. But it was to understand what success would look like for them. What was the thing that they were trying to be able to understand, communicate, or to prove? And what you find over and over again is, in general, most people are trying to make communities better. They're trying to make society better. They're trying to sort of do good by their sort of organization. Well, what does that mean? And how do they communicate sort of the justification behind the types of decisions they're making? And by sort of helping them to sort of either clarify or to use data to understand sort of the case that they're trying to make, you can then also, and this is the secret sauce, ask them questions that you're authentically curious about that gets them to think differentially. So explain to me sort of, if you're thinking about this type of treatment of going here to there, how does that affect these other types of, and I don't know wastewater enough to give you some good questions about that, but, what would you consider sort of, healthy sort of within this community, or how would you approach it? And then it, again, puts them in the position of the expert, but it probably gets them to think about things at either a different scale or a different connection or a different part of the system that they never had to articulate before. And so even though they're giving you sort of what's clearly an answer, they probably haven't thought about it. They probably haven't sort of made that connection in a tangible way before. And Margaret, I know, has a better answer.
And before you go on to Margaret, do you do that in a one-on-one kind of, you're the private or a small group, or do you, make it kind of more public? To me, if it's more public, they're more inhibited. So they're going to be more on the spot and less open with you. But is there a procedure there?
Yes. And Margaret will tell you.
So I can show you what that looks like. So here's an example. This is the decision theorem. So I would say one version of the secret sauce is using the data in it, that implicit, tacit knowledge, and get it out into the discussion environment. And so this is a workshop I helped several faculty from Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College run about global learning metrics. And they had gotten funding to host a symposium of people from all over the United States, several international organizations, to discuss what would global learning metrics look like. And we created kind of like a straw man data informatic using real data, but we put it up in a DT drum and we critiqued it. We spent 2 hours as a diverse group critiquing people's kind of implicit biases and their ways of understanding data, and what one graph meant to one organization was wildly different than what that same graph meant to someone who was looking at the problem in a completely different way. And so just the virtue of having that really diverse group in the room, hearing each other make sense of this, was an incredibly valuable, rich experience. We've taken a slightly different approach in the education project, and I described this is described in the paper that I linked earlier. Sometimes it makes more sense to bring people in one-on-one, depending on the sensitivity of the data or the sensitivity of the question or the stage you're at in your relationship development with that organization. Sometimes you start by just that one-on-one kind of special quality time. And then once you've established that foundation of trust, we're not going to embarrass you with this data in a large diverse group of people, for example. Once you get to the point of this workshop and you invite them, then they have that trust in you, and they're much more willing to be a contributor in that kind of wider, diverse forum.
Thank you. That's great.
We have one question from Ben in the chat. Ben, you want to ask the question?
Sure, yeah. Thanks for this talk. Really inspiring. The first point I made is just that I realized that when you were listing the real research questions that you had, Erik, they're very grand, and it made me realize that I tend to, I think, falsely conflate the idea of humility with smallness. And this idea that you can be humble and ask big questions is, I think, inspiring. So thanks for that. The question is, what if for instance, the crab farmers or the crabbers and the farmers in the Chesapeake Bay hadn't been able to so neatly kind of win-win resolve their differences? How do we design for an institutional process that negotiates conflicts that are not necessarily zero-sum, but are clearly not win-win? And is there a difference in designing for these kinds of systems of mutual aggregate understanding that you've been describing, and a system that designs for the negotiation over conflict?
And toward that end, I think I see and I'll try to address your question, but I see the framing of the question slightly differently, which is that the win-win options were not even possible until they were able to participate in potential solutions and reframing of the challenges. And so it was more about sort of opening up entire categories of potential solutions by including more voices, more perspectives, and more people that can actually switch, their perspectives or sort of adjust what it is that they're doing. And so the first part about this was by getting people involved as a co-creator in the potential solution space, look at the new options that became possible. The second part of what I talk about is there are real places that conflict exists, and we should spend meaningful time, energy, and effort in trying to resolve those. But the question then becomes, well, how are we spending our time and energy? And is it on these places of true conflict? Or is it really on understanding where the other person's coming from? Or is it really on, figuring out what the data is interpreting or what it's actually meaning? And so it's going back to this sort of broad question within the overall talk, does this help us focus our attention on places of meaningful conflict? Because it has not automated, but just made the ability to address and understand sort of these easier solutions much more viable. And the other key point here is that if people are part of the co-creation process, if they feel their voice is being heard, if they feel they can influence outcomes, they are far more likely to be willing to engage in sort of these conflict avoidance tasks and willing to give up resources. And we did studies on that, and about sort of how does the decision theater change how they actually participate within these dilemmas. And if they see it as a shared problem of which they are one of the people accountable for the solution, they're more likely to give up their own position, their own resources, and everything else, versus if they see themselves as competing against everyone else and needing to protect their position. They're not. And so these technologies can create that sense of community engagement and a common fate and a shared challenge that we're all trying to collectively address, like we should have been thinking about with pandemic responses, that collectively we will get through this instead of it is us versus whatever. We are over time. I know that because my wife just texted me, are you still talking? And I don't want to sort of take up anyone else's time. I've noticed a number of emails that have come in that will ask for notes. I'll send those to you within the next 5 minutes. And so if I don't, feel free to follow up with me. And I love this stuff. I've worked with the GovLab. We worked with the MacArthur Foundation. There's a lot of communities that are doing this type of work. And the Center for Smart Cities and Regions and the stuff that Julia is doing is all sort of within this space.
Right. Erik, thank you so much for the talk. I know you have to go, and everybody, we will follow up with another panel discussion later on. We'll invite everybody from this seminar series back for a panel discussion. So stay tuned. Erik, thank you so much. We'll email you for the notes, and have a wonderful weekend, everybody, and Halloween.
Thank you, Erik. Thank you.
Thank you,
Have a
Julia.
wonderful
And
weekend.
Gloria, I just saw your message. I saw it. Okay.
Bye.
Take care, everybody.